Good evening, everybody. We are going to move into our next PowerPoint on the age of absolutism. This time, however, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe. So far, we've already covered the rule of Louis XIV, but now we're going to focus on the rule of the family known as the Habsburgs. Now, we have discussed the Habsburgs in detail, knowing that they are one of the most powerful families in Europe, mainly ruling out of the country of Austria. So throughout the 17th century, Central Europe, as we know, was pretty much made up of the Holy Roman Empire. And you can see from this map, it's one that we've looked at before, the fragments of Germany, and that large orange section is Austria, the country of Austria. However, the empire, even though it was called an empire, wasn't really an empire, or neither was it Holy or Roman. But in fact, it was made up of a loose network of very small states, and each of those individual states had their own ruler, as we learned when we discussed different conflicts that happened during the Reformation. One of the states, of course, was Austria, that map that I showed you before that made up the large orange section. So it was the largest state in the Holy Roman Empire. Easily, it was probably one of the most important states, and the reason for that not only was its size, but that also was the seat of where the Holy Roman Emperor came from, and that was the tradition which we had talked about earlier when we discussed Charles V. And so the Habsburg family ruled from Austria. We do know, however, that the Habsburgs started to weaken specifically because of what happened during and after the 30 Years' War. France, as a result, wound up becoming the most powerful nation on the continent, and that monopoly that everybody was worried about of the Habsburgs taking over Europe was weakened. And that's because they lost some land in the 30 Years' War and also their reputation as well. The War of Spanish Succession that we discussed with Louis XIV also continued to weaken them, especially because no longer was there a Habsburg ruling in Spain, but instead Spain was taken over by a Bourbon. So as we mentioned earlier, there was a tradition that the Habsburg ruler of Austria would almost always be elected the Holy Roman Emperor as well. We already saw that before with Charles V, and this was a tradition that's going to continue for centuries after that. The challenge, however, that the Habsburgs had to deal with was the fact that they ruled over a very diverse group of people. They did not have a strong, united kingdom like France, for example, where pretty much everyone who lived there was French. But instead, in Austria, they included not only people from the Holy Roman Empire, but they also had parts of Italy, parts of Belgium, Hungary, and Transylvania. And so you could see why this would pose a problem for the empire, or for the Habsburgs, I should say, because there's so many different cultures that they have to try to unite under one way of ruling. From 1658 to 1705, the Holy Roman Emperor was Leopold I. He was a Habsburg. We're going to talk a little bit about him. He was the first cousin of Louis XIV, and he was a devout Catholic, just like his predecessors. Most of the Habsburgs we know were Catholic. He listened to the advice of Jesuit advisors, and as a result, he tried very hard to tightly restrict any rights that Protestants wanted in the Holy Roman Empire. Now we know, going all the way back to the Peace of Augsburg, that they were entitled to certain rights, and then even the Treaty of Westphalia, Calvinists as well were allowed to worship freely in the empire. However, the Habsburgs are going to continue to struggle to try to maintain control over the Protestants in their territory. Something you should take away, though, about Leopold, just like other absolute rulers that we've discussed, specifically Louis XIV, he was a huge supporter of the arts, and as a result, he was able to turn Austria into the musical center of Europe. And so a lot of the buildings and architecture and music coming out of Austria, we can thank King Leopold for that. He actually was known as the musical king. The other thing that he did to support art of the time period is that he brought the Baroque style to art and architecture. Here are some modern day pictures of buildings in Austria, but you can see that they resemble Baroque with the curved lines and the ornate details. One of the things that Leopold had to deal with was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at this time, we haven't discussed it much, but they were a pretty common enemy for all Europeans. And as you guys hopefully know, that's because they were ruled by Muslim leaders. And so the Ottoman Empire at this point had started to expand drastically under the rulership of someone named Suleiman the Lawgiver. And Suleiman was a very, very successful ruler for the Muslims because he was able to conquer land and control his large Ottoman Empire. Well, the threat came directly into Europe in 1683 when he invaded Austria, specifically the city of Vienna. And so as a result, Leopold needed to fight back, mainly because as a good Catholic, he wanted to prevent Muslims from taking over Europe. And so he rallied his armies together to So as I mentioned, Suleiman and his armies made it close to Vienna, and it was put under siege. But eventually, long story short, sparing you the gory details, the Ottomans were eventually defeated. So let's figure out now what's going to happen with Leopold's family. Well, he married the daughter of the King of Spain, and ironically enough, in good Habsburg fashion, she was not only his first cousin, but also his niece. Not really sure how that works out, but you can do the math. Anyway, when he died, they did have a son, and his son was Charles VI, and he's going to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. Charles wound up ruling for the next 30 years, and your book does go into a little bit of detail about what Charles VI was able to accomplish, so you can read the details there. But the main thing that he's mostly known for is that he was able to give Hungary freedom from the Habsburgs. So Hungary now is going to become its own independent state in the Holy Roman Empire. And they were able to rule themselves, not necessarily through the direct rule of the Habsburgs. And this was good for Hungary because, as we mentioned before, they were significantly culturally different. So they really didn't have anything in common with Austria. As we mentioned before, the Holy Roman Empire was very difficult to rule, and so this is going to be the same for Charles. Its borders were a wide assortment of people. This included Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, Croatians, Germans, and if you guys know anything about those cultures, they're very, very different. They speak different languages, they eat different food, they wear different clothing, and so because of this diverse culture, this is going to pose a problem for anyone who rules over the Holy Roman Empire. And this is one of the main reasons why Germany winds up uniting later on, and we'll discuss that in quarter 3. So after Charles VI died, his power is going to pass on to the next absolute ruler that we're going to discuss, and that was his oldest daughter, who was Maria Theresa. Now, it's important to note that this is the first time in Habsburg history that rulership would go to a female. A woman had never before ruled a Habsburg nation. Just so you know, this is an interesting picture. It's also in your textbook. That is Maria Theresa there on the right, sitting on the throne. And she did have 16 children, or 15, I forget, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So she was a good mother. She actually earned the nickname the Mother of Europe because of what she was able to accomplish. And so we're going to talk about her now. The reason that Maria Theresa was able to take the throne is because of something that Charles did before he died. He was afraid that his enemies or even neighboring lands might dispute the fact that a woman had the right to take the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And so he drew up this document that you see here that's called the Pragmatic Sanction. That's definitely an important term that you need to know. So the Pragmatic Sanction basically allowed for It was a document stating that, yes, indeed, his daughter would be the next ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Unfortunately for Maria, however, he didn't really do a good job in giving her any information on how to rule. So she basically had to fend for herself. But believe it or not, she did a very good job. So just as her father had thought, because she was a woman, it was declared by most European powers that she was ineligible to rule. And so this is going to cause a war because of it. The first person to attack her was her neighbor to the north, and he was the ruler of Prussia. And we're going to talk about him tomorrow in tomorrow's PowerPoint. And his name was Frederick II, also later going to be known as Frederick the Great, another absolute ruler. And the reason that he fought her for the throne is because Prussia, which is mainly modern-day Germany, was an area in northern Germany, so also part of the Holy Roman Empire. So he, of course, wanted to claim the throne for himself so that he could gain more power. Frederick also wanted the Austrian land of Silesia. And so you can see here on this slide, Silesia is the area in yellow. So you see Austria in green in the south, Prussia is in purple in the north. And the thing about Prussia is they were not rich in any type of raw materials. They really didn't have a lot going for them, except the fact that they were on the Baltic Sea, which is usually covered by ice. So it was difficult for Prussia to become powerful, and so as a result, they wanted to gain more land so that they could be richer. And Silesia was rich in iron ore. It had several areas available for textiles and also food products. So we can see why Frederick, of course, wanted to take over this land. And he thought that by claiming the throne as the next Holy Roman Emperor, Prussia, it is important to understand, and this I will go into more detail about this tomorrow, they had become a very powerful power, a rising power at this particular time. And the main reason for that is because of their military. And that has to do with Frederick's father. He was known as the military king. And he was able to raise a completely professional army. And so this was really, really important because it showed that they had their loyalty to Frederick. So what's going to happen next is pretty interesting. Again, we're going to start to see an alliance system start to form. France, Spain, and Sweden wound up going against their Habsburg enemies. Because remember, France and Spain at this point are Burman, and even though they're Catholic, religion isn't playing a role anymore at all. It's completely political. So France and Spain and then Sweden went against the Habsburgs, against Maria Theresa. England, the Dutch Republic, and Russia came to the aid of Austria and Maria Theresa. So we start to see these two different alliances coming together. And the whole point of these countries getting involved was to try to maintain a balance of power. This large-scale war later becomes known as the War of Austrian Succession. And it's called that because they were fighting over who had the right to become the next ruler of Austria, because they did not believe that Maria Theresa had that right to rule. Here's a quick video. It's about 4 minutes long. You do not have an assignment that goes with this video, but I want you to watch it just so it can give you all of the details about this particular war. Most of the fighting during the War of Austrian Succession was between Austria and Prussia, obviously between Maria Theresa and Frederick II. But unfortunately, the battlefield was in the German states, just like it was in the 30 Years' War. The war lasted for 9 years, and ultimately there really wasn't a winner. I guess you could say Maria Theresa won because she was able to keep the throne, but it was very inconclusive, and here's why. First of all, it ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, and that's basically the city where the treaty was signed. The treaty had 4 major effects. Number 1, Prussia now became independent of the Holy Roman Empire and became its own major power. That was huge because before Prussia was under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire, but now they were able to rule themselves independently. Austria was weakened. It wasn't destroyed. It still is going to be a very important country in Central Europe, and it's still going to be the seat of where the Holy Roman Emperor is going to come from, but it definitely was weakened. And so as a result, this balance of power that I mentioned before was created in Europe between the great powers. What that means is it started to show the alliance system that we talked about before. Countries are joining sides and ultimately trying to maintain that balance of power throughout Europe so that nobody could come in and dominate one over the other. However, it is important to note that Maria Theresa was able to remain on the Austrian throne. However, she is no longer called the Holy Roman Empress. However, it is important to understand that she pretty much still maintained her power even though she didn't have that title. In fact, her husband wound up taking on the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but ultimately she was the one making the decisions and pulling the strings. So she was able to show her enemies, however, that a female ruler could fight and would fight to remain in power. So just because you don't think a woman should be in power, she proved to them that don't mess with a woman because we still have the ability to fight if we need to. As I mentioned, the Holy Roman Emperor became her husband, but she made sure that he did not control any part of Austria. So he kind of pulled the strings in the rest of the empire while she still maintained control over Austria. So as I mentioned before, she was given the nickname the Mother of Europe, and that's because she gave birth to 16 children. There's the number. I wasn't sure if it was 15 or 16. 16 children, and 2 of her sons would later on to also become emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Her youngest daughter also, it is important that you note who she is because we're going to talk about her when we discuss the French Revolution. But her youngest daughter is Marie Antoinette, and she would become later the Queen of France. So let's talk a little bit about Maria Theresa and her character as an absolute monarch. One of the things that she highly, highly valued was education. And so she is known to have built the first military academy in Austria and also the world's first school of engineering. So something she definitely could be proud of. She also built up the army from about 30,000 to over 108,000. And so it was under her rule that Austria had one of the best militaries. And she needed to do that, especially if she was going to be able to stand up against Frederick. She was an extremely religious Catholic, so it is important to understand that. However, she took care of her subjects better than most of the monarchs we discussed. She had a very nurturing quality about her, and the condition of her subjects was very important to her. Upon the death of her husband, it's also important to note that she wore black for the remaining 15 years of her life. So she was very loyal. She is not known to have conducted any affairs or anything like that. She was loyal to her husband and also played a very active role in raising her children, which was pretty rare for a king or a queen to do that back then. However, as she died, when she did die, she was remembered fondly by her people with the title Enlightened Monarch or Enlightened Despot. And we're going to talk about several other monarchs who had this title. This is a whole nother chapter. But basically what that means is they were educated by means of the Enlightenment. She would often surround herself with the French philosophers of the time to help her make decisions about government. So it is important to note, however, that during the 650 years that the Habsburgs ruled in the Holy Roman Empire, Maria Theresa was the only female ruler, but certainly something that she can be proud of and is known today as a very powerful, absolute, and enlightened ruler. Upon her death, her oldest son Joseph II, became the new ruler of Austria, and he was going to continue a lot of the things that his mother had put in place. He was technically actually co-ruler with her during the last 15 years of her rule. So he certainly was trained by his mother, unlike the way that she was not trained by her father. She wanted to make sure that her son was educated in ruling over Austria. He is known as the musical king because he too also brought a lot of music to Vienna and is also considered to be an enlightened despot. He died in 1790, shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolution, which is in fact going to be our next unit after this and after Enlightenment, so stay tuned for that. But that pretty much wraps up the absolute monarchs in Austria. It is important to note what they were able to accomplish, and you can find some more details about that in your textbook. Please make sure that you read the pages that I have provided for you. And I will see you in class tomorrow.